Officer Craig Dutton was still laughing when he sat down to write his report, not laughing out loud, because he was alone at his desk and the bullpen was thin. And at this hour the night shift grinding down toward midnight, but laughing in the interior way of a man who has just confirmed something he already believed about himself. Something that has been confirmed enough times now that the confirmation itself has become a kind of pleasure, a private satisfaction he carries the way other men carry pride in a well-made thing. A good stop, a clean escalation, a clean collar. The kid had even given him something to work with, which was more than Dutton usually needed, because in 18 years he had learned that you rarely needed much. He positioned his hands over the keyboard and pulled up the blank incident report form, and before he began typing, he paused for exactly 2 seconds to choose between two phrases displayed, nervousness or exhibited evasive behavior, and selected the second one because it sounded more clinical, more like documentation and less like opinion, which was the difference between a report that sailed through review and one that invited questions nobody wanted to answer. He cracked his knuckles. He began to type. His phone buzzed on the desk beside him, and he did not look at it because he was mid-sentence constructing the architecture of the thing, and he did not like to interrupt his momentum once he had found it. The phone buzzed a second time. He looked at text from Larkin, his partner who had finished his own paperwork 20 minutes ago and gone to the break room. The text said, "Come to the break room. Now." Dutton stared at the word now, which was carrying a quality of urgency that Larkin's texts did not usually carry, and he saved his draft and stood up, and he would later understand reconstructing the sequence with the precision of a man who has nothing but time for reconstruction. That the 30 seconds between sitting at his keyboard and standing up from his chair was the last moment of his old life. 2 hours earlier, Jordan Ellis Webb was thinking about the texture of old brick, which was the kind of problem that had no urgency to it, but that occupied the back of his mind the way certain artistic problems did, persistently, patiently, presenting itself at odd moments, like a question waiting for the right angle of light to answer it. He was working on a charcoal drawing of his grandfather's neighborhood on the south side of the city, a block of row houses that was disappearing one building at a time into the machinery of development, and the problem he could not solve was the mortar. Specifically, the way old mortar caught light differently from the face of the brick, the way each individual surface had weathered at its own rate over 40 or 50 years of rain and heat and cold, until the block as a whole had a texture that was not uniform, but deeply specifically individual, and charcoal wanted to generalize where this subject demanded precision. He had been turning the problem over in the back of his mind for most of the evening, while the front of his mind was occupied with fractions because Tuesday nights belonged to the 8 kids at the Orchard Street Community Center, ages 11 to 14, math tutoring 45 minutes each direction, and every minute of it worth it. He had been doing this since he was 15, first assigned to a single 7th grader named Devin who had failed his standardized test and whose mother had called the center in desperation, and the group had expanded from there, as word traveled among the families who used the center, that there was a teenager who showed up reliably and who had the particular gift, rarer than mathematical ability itself, of being able to explain what he understood to someone who did not yet understand it, of finding the angle of entry into a problem that matched the specific shape of another person's confusion. Tonight, Devin had solved 4 consecutive problems on his own, and when he looked up from the 4th one, he had an expression on his face of such surprised, genuine pleasure, the specific delight of a person who has been waiting to discover they are capable of something and has just discovered it, that Jordan felt it like warmth in the center of his chest. And that feeling was what he did this for, not the line it would add to his college applications, not the commendation from Dorothy Simmons, who ran the center with a combination of institutional rigor and genuine human care that was, in Jordan's experience, the rarest of administrative qualities. He did it for that specific look on Devin's face, which was its own complete and sufficient reward. The brick problem had solved itself the way artistic problems sometimes did. Sideways and unexpectedly, while he was walking Devin through the mechanics of a fraction problem. Use the edge of the charcoal stick rather than the face work in the direction of the mortar lines, rather than across them, build the texture from its structural logic, rather than trying to simulate its surface appearance. He had wanted to pull out his sketchbook and test the technique immediately. He had not. He finished the session, helped stack the chairs, said goodbye to Dorothy, and walked out to his mother's car. Gloria Webb's 2009 silver Chevy Malibu sat under a halogen light in the center lot. Clean, with the honest wear of a vehicle that had been maintained rather than pampered, and Jordan had been the primary driver for the past year, while his mother's schedule at the hospital had compressed her available hours into the kind of packed, unforgiving routine that left little room for anything else. He checked the tire pressure on the first of every month. He kept the interior clean. He had replaced the right tail light bulb with his father 4 months ago on a Saturday afternoon, his father guiding him through the process with the patience of a man who believed the value of tasks like this one lay not in the task itself, but in the hour of proximity. They required the way the simplest shared work could say things that neither person had found the words for. His grandfather's box cutter was in the seat pocket of the passenger door, and it had been there for 4 months. A Stanley model orange-handled and silver-accented blade retracted completely into the body, smaller than a television remote. Henry Ellis had carried one every working day for 34 years at the hardware store on Clement Street, had used it to open boxes, cut twine, score cardboard for shipping, and nothing else had carried it in his jacket pocket. With the unthinking automatism of a man who works with his hands and keeps his tools close, and when he died, Jordan had taken it from the table beside the hospital bed and put it in the seat pocket of the Malibu without fully articulating to himself why, only that it was warm and orange-handled and smelled very faintly of the inside of his grandfather's jacket, and there it had stayed unremarkable and entirely ordinary. Jordan placed his tutoring folder and sketchbook on the passenger seat, checked his phone texts from his mother, asking when he'd be home. A calendar notification about a college application deadline texted back, heading home. Now love you, and started the car. The drive was a route he knew well enough that his hands found the turns without conscious direction, and he drove with the radio low and the window cracked an inch, and his mind still running quietly on the brick texture problem, testing the edge of charcoal solution against his mental image of the row house wall, adjusting, refining. He was thinking about Devon's face. He was thinking about the college essay he had drafted on Sunday, whether it was honest enough, whether he had been too careful about how he presented himself. He was 18 years old, and his scholarship letter was on his desk at home, and his tutoring notes were on the passenger seat beside his sketchbook, and his future was in front of him. Earned and real and full of possibilities he had worked hard enough to deserve. The lights hit him like a detonation, red and blue, silent and strobing, erupting in his rear-view mirror without warning and fracturing through the raindrops on his windshield into a wash of color that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. In the way that certain things are both at once, the two sensations inseparable, each one intensifying the other. His stomach dropped before any rational thought arrived. His hands tightened on the wheel, and before he had assessed the situation or identified the specific quality of the threat, a feeling moved through him that his mother had described to him when he was 14, and that he had recognized immediately as something he had already been carrying without a name for years before she gave it one. The feeling was not guilt. It bore the shape of guilt, but it was not guilt. It was something that had been installed in him by the world before he was old enough to consent to it. A primal anticipatory dread that arrived before facts. Before cause, before any reason other than the fact of his body in this car on this street at this hour, and his mother had told him it would come before he knew why. And she had been right. "You are not doing anything wrong," he told himself in his own voice that sounded in that moment more like his father's. "You are Jordan Webb. You are going home from tutoring. You have done nothing wrong." He signaled his lane change even though there was no one behind him, except the cruiser, because the protocol was the protocol, and every step of it mattered in ways that could not be abbreviated. He eased to the curb with a deceleration so smooth it barely registered. He put the car in park. He turned on the dome light. He rolled the window down halfway, He placed both hands at 10 and 2 and spread his fingers flat against the wheel and held them there, visible and still. He breathed carefully, counting the breaths, and he watched the side mirror, and he waited. His speedometer had read exactly 30 miles per hour. Both taillights were burning steady and red in the mirror. He had done nothing wrong. He had done nothing wrong. He had done nothing wrong. He waited, and the door of the cruiser opened, and Officer Craig Dutton got out and began walking toward him from the passenger side. Dutton walked slowly, because there was no reason to hurry, and he let the beam of his flashlight sweep the Malibu's exterior as he approached. Clean car, properly maintained, no visible damage. Current registration sticker on the plate, and his eyes moved to the rear lights. Both tail lights glowing red and functional in the dark, and he noted this and kept walking because the tail light was already a settled matter in his mind, even though both lights were clearly lit, because the reason for the stop was not a real reason, but a starting point, and starting points did not need to be accurate, only plausible. He had learned the passenger side approach from a veteran named Garland who had retired to Florida 12 years ago, and who had passed on over 3 years of shared night shifts a collection of tactical refinements that existed nowhere in the department handbook and were transmitted the way certain kinds of institutional knowledge are transmitted orally, informally in the front seat of a cruiser. During the slow hours, the passenger side approach forced the driver to turn their body to establish eye contact, disrupted their spatial orientation, put the officer in visual control of more of the vehicle's interior, and Dutton had performed it so many times it was no longer a choice but simply what he did. He bent to the window, interior dome light on, both of the driver's hands spread wide on the steering wheel, fingers visible. The specific choreography of a person who has been coached on this encounter, or who has survived enough of them to know the steps, and Dutton processed the rest of the visual information with practice speed. Young black male, late teens. Clean clothes, no visible agitation. Passenger seat, holding a sketchbook and a folder of papers, nothing threatening in the immediate sweep, nothing that justified the stop on its own merits. But that was fine because justification was not the point. The point was the starting point, and then you waited for something useful to present itself. He said good evening with the slight pause after it. That authority naturally produced the expectant silence designed to pull the other person into filling it, and the driver responded. Voice steady, well modulated, the specific quality of controlled steadiness. And Dutton said, the right tail light was out, which it was not. And he had known it was not when he said it, and he said it anyway, with the easy confidence of a man who has said similar things many times, and for whom authority in a uniform has always been sufficient currency, because in 18 years it always had been. Jordan said he was sorry to hear that he hadn't been aware, and his voice remained completely calm. And Dutton moved his flashlight off the driver's face and let it drift to the passenger seat, the sketchbook, the folder of tutoring papers, and he let it linger there with the practiced patience of a man who believes that if you wait long enough, something useful will present itself. He requested license registration and proof of insurance watching as Jordan narrated his movements before making them, reaching for the glove compartment now, and retrieved the documents with the deliberate slowness of someone who understood exactly how quickly a reaching hand could be misinterpreted in the dark. Jordan held them out between 2 fingers with his arm fully extended. Dutton took them without comment, glanced at the name Jordan E. Webb, and passed the documents to his partner, Shane Larkin, who had come up on the driver's side and was now looking at the registration with the focused attention of a man reading something he wanted to read very carefully, his jaw going tight in a way his face did when he was absorbing information he would have preferred not to absorb. Dutton asked what all the papers on the seat were, and Jordan explained art supplies, tutoring, materials. Community center on Orchard Street, math. Tutoring on Tuesday nights. And Dutton repeated the phrase, art supplies, in a tone that treated it as a category requiring investigation rather than a self-evident answer, and glanced at Larkin over the roof of the car, and Larkin did not return the glance. Dutton told Jordan to step out of the vehicle, and Jordan asked calmly and clearly whether he was being detained and what the specific reason was, and Dutton said there had been a string of break-ins in the area, and Jordan fit the description they had been working with, which was a complete fabrication. There had been no radio dispatch, no circulating description, no active break-in investigation within 6 blocks of this stretch of road that night. And Larkin knew this standing on the driver's side with the registration in his hands and his jaw still tight, and he said nothing. Jordan said he understood and would comply fully and stepped out of the car with both hands visible throughout the motion, palms open and slightly elevated, communicating everything that non-threatening posture can communicate, and he stood on the curb and did not step back because he had been taught that stepping back was an invitation to a particular kind of interpretation, and he had been taught to give as few invitations as possible. Dutton moved around the front of the car and used his physical bulk to press the available territory, and Jordan held his ground with the composed stillness of someone who has been told that stillness is the safest available language and who believes the person who told him because the person who told him was his mother, and his mother was always right. And when Dutton said hands on the hood, Jordan complied and the pat-down was rough and found nothing. Wallet, phone, nothing else, and Larkin moved to the passenger door and began searching the interior, and the silence lasted perhaps 45 seconds. Jordan heard the rustle of his tutoring folder. He heard the soft, familiar sound of his sketchbook being moved. He heard the pages turn. He kept his hands on the hood and his face forward, and he breathed. And then he heard the specific metallic sound of something being lifted from the seat pocket. Larkin's voice was flat and carefully neutral. "Look at this." He held up the Stanley box cutter, orange-handled and silver-accented blade retracted completely into the body. Smaller than a television remote, an entirely ordinary object that could be purchased at any hardware store in the country for $3, and Dutton looked at it, and the specific recognizable change crossed his face. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but real and unmistakable to anyone watching closely. The quiet settling of a man who has found what he needed, or close enough. Jordan said it was his grandfather's box cutter. A tool. It had been in the car for months. Anyone could see what it was, and his voice had risen 1 degree in pitch, and he caught it and brought it back down, and he turned to Larkin not frantically, deliberately, with the last available measure of composure he had, and he looked at the younger officer with an appeal in his eyes that he kept out of his voice because he had been taught to keep it out. "You can see what that is. You know what that is. Please tell him what that is." Larkin looked at the box cutter. He looked at Jordan. He looked at the ground. His lips pressed together once briefly, the external expression of an internal argument that had been running since the moment he registered the absolute, unambiguous compliance of every movement Jordan had made, and he said nothing. Dutton came around behind Jordan and brought his wrists together at the small of his back with the mechanical efficiency of a motion performed hundreds of times. Right, wrist, left wrist, click, click, and tightened the cuffs to 1 notch past what the situation required. The specific fraction of excess that was invisible in documentation, but entirely legible to the person wearing them. The precise bite of metal against bone that said, "Without words, I decide how much this hurts." Jordan felt the steel against the bones of his wrists. He cataloged it. He was cataloging everything. Now Dutton's badge number memorized from the nameplate, every word spoken on this street, every timestamp on every clock, he had been able to read, because an accurate account was the only thing he could carry out of this night. Intact, the only thing that could not be taken or distorted or filed away in a drawer. A draft from the passenger door caught his sketchbook, and Jordan heard it before he could turn to see it, the soft fan of pages opening, the rustle of loose sheets catching air, and then the specific mournful sound of paper settling onto wet asphalt. His drawings of his grandfather's neighborhood, the row houses disappearing one by one, the mortar lines he had finally figured out how to render, slid from between the sketchbook's covers and drifted down onto the damp road, one by one, their charcoal lines immediately beginning to absorb the moisture, the images softening at the edges where the water touched them. He watched them fall, and he said nothing. Dutton guided him to the cruiser, and Jordan walked to it and bent his head for the door with a careful, practiced motion and sat on the hard plastic seat with his hands behind his back and the cuffs' cold weight present and specific and through the scratched plexiglass. He watched Larkin stand beside the open passenger door of the Malibu for a long moment, looking down at the scattered pages on the wet asphalt. And then Larkin bent down and gathered every loose sheet, carefully shuffled them back into the sketchbook, placed the book back on the seat, closed the car door. He straightened up and stood in the dark with his hands at his sides, his face doing something complicated and private that the darkness partially concealed. Then he walked to the driver's side of the cruiser and got in without speaking. In the front seat, Dutton called it in to dispatch, his voice easy with the particular energy of a man who has had a satisfying night. Dutton brought Jordan through the double doors at 11:47, with his hand clamped on Jordan's shoulder, in the demonstrative way of a man presenting a result. The hand said, "I went out, and I came back with something," and the bullpen's night shift occupants looked up with the assessing, categorical attention of people who had seen this entrance many times and who had long since stopped looking past the category to the individual inside it. Dutton dropped the evidence bag on the booking desk in front of Sergeant Roy Becker, the orange-handled box cutter sealed in clear plastic, a number written on the outside, and announced it as a cedarwood stop, concealed blade. Suspicious circumstances, and Becker looked at the bag, and then at Jordan with the dismissive scan of a man looking at a category rather than a person, and offered a joke about the artist that he clearly considered amusing. And Dutton said something like that, and the two of them shared a moment of institutional self-satisfaction that had nothing in it resembling what was actually in that evidence bag. 3 minutes later, the desk phone rang. Dorothy Simmons, the community center director who had noticed the Malibu was gone from the parking lot without any word from Jordan and had tried his cell phone, gotten no answer, and was now calling the station. Her voice careful and professionally measured, but carrying the specific tension of a person who is worried and is trying not to show it in a way that will get her dismissed. Becker answered, listened for 15 seconds, told her he had no information to provide at this time, and suggested she call back in the morning. Jordan was 4 meters away in handcuffs. Becker hung up and returned to his paperwork without looking up. The booking process was 40 minutes long, and was designed whether or not anyone involved consciously intended the design to achieve a specific psychological result through the accumulation of small administrative acts, each one individually unremarkable and collectively devastating. Jordan was told to remove his shoes, his belt, his wallet, his phone, the $3 in his pocket, the chapstick, his grandfather's brass house key. Each item extracted and catalogued with the detached indifference of a process that was not interested in the meaning of the items to the person they were being taken from, and the clerk who fingerprinted him rolled each finger with the professional disconnection of a person who had rolled many fingers and had stopped connecting them to human beings at some point years ago. They brought Jordan to stand against the white wall with the height markers behind him, the camera lens at eye level, and in the fraction of a second before the flash, he made a decision about his face, a decision his mother had described to him without ever explicitly calling it a decision. The specific choice in the specific moment of what to present when the document being created will outlast the moment and exist permanently as a piece of evidence about who you are. He chose steadiness, not defiance, because defiance was recharacterizable, not fear, because fear was its own gift to the people who had created the situation, but the quality of erect, composed attention that said to anyone who was actually looking, "I know who I am. This is not who I am." "Flash," he said to Becker. When the mugshot was done, voice steady, clear. "My name is Jordan Webb, and my father is..." And Becker raised one hand with the practiced economy of a gesture that had interrupted many similar sentences and said, "Yeah, I've heard it before. Son, save it for after you're processed, and said it without cruelty and without any particular engagement, which Jordan registered as somehow more complete as a dismissal than anger would have been. because anger at least would have acknowledged that the sentence had content worth reacting to. At the booking phone, Jordan called his mother first and reached her voicemail. She was still at the hospital with her phone in her locker, then called Dorothy Simmons and reached her voicemail as well, and then he stood with the receiver in his hand and ran through his remaining options and dialed his father. The voicemail greeting said, "You've reached Calvin Webb. Please leave a message." The professional name, the public voice, and Jordan spoke into it with his voice held as level as he could make it, giving the essential facts in sequence. Arrested at the Midfield 14th Precinct on Fenwick Road. Officer Dutton, his grandfather's box cutter. The tail light was not out. He had done nothing wrong. His voice fractured for exactly half a second on the word nothing. A single brief crack in the surface, and he sealed it immediately and finished the message and hung up and handed the phone back to the officer without assistance. Cell 3 was 8 feet wide and 10 feet long, with a metal bench bolted to the rear wall and a fluorescent light mounted behind wire mesh in the ceiling that buzzed at a frequency just below conscious awareness, but that made the air feel slightly wrong, in a way that became more noticeable the longer you were in it. Jordan sat on the metal bench and placed his wrists on his knees and looked at the marks the handcuffs had left. Curved red lines already deepening in color. Tender when he pressed them with his thumbs, and he pressed them carefully and noted the specific quality of the tenderness because he was going to carry every detail of this night out of here intact. He thought about his grandfather, about Henry Ellis's hands on a Saturday morning. Unhurried and sure, the hands of a man who believed that work done properly was its own form of dignity, and the idea that someone could look at that orange-handled box cutter and see through the lens of a prior decision, something that it was not. See only what they had already decided to see, felt less like injustice than like a profound failure of seeing that went far deeper than any individual object. From the cell to his left, a voice came through the bars. Quiet, flat, carrying no particular emotion, and the voice said, "You didn't do it either." Not as a question, simply as a statement of recognition, the acknowledgement of one person who has been in this position before identifying another. And Jordan said, "No." And the young man in the next cell nodded once and pulled his knees up and said nothing else, and they sat together in the buzzing silence of two strangers in a situation that should not have required a shared understanding between them, but did. Jordan held his father's professional voicemail greeting like an anchor. "You've reached Calvin Webb. Please leave a message," held the knowledge that his father was the kind of man who checked his messages and the kind of man who acted on what he heard in them. And he pressed that knowledge against the cold of the metal bench and the buzz of the fluorescent light and the deepening marks on his wrists, and he decided something in the quiet of that cell. He was going to be all right. Not tonight, tonight was what it was, but he was going to be all right because he knew who he was with a specificity and certainty that no mugshot and no fabricated charge and no cold metal bench could alter. He sat up straight. He folded his hands in his lap. He waited. Shane Larkin sat at his desk with the supplemental report form open on his screen. His name in the officer identification field, everything else empty. And he had been staring at this screen for 19 minutes, his hands on the desk beside the keyboard and not on the keys. He thought about the 45 seconds he had stood outside the passenger door of the Malibu, looking at Jordan's sketchbook pages on the wet asphalt, and about why he had bent down and gathered them, and what it had cost him to do that one small decent thing in the middle of an indecent night, and whether that small cost had been in any way sufficient for what he had then failed to do. At the adjacent desk, Dutton was typing his incident report, with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who has written this document many times and who understands that the craft of it lies not in accuracy, but in internal consistency and strategic plausibility. He was describing Jordan's compliance as evasiveness, describing Jordan's precise, trained stillness as furtive behavior, describing the 43-second delay between the stop and Jordan's exit from the vehicle as resistance to a lawful order, describing the box cutter as a modified blade concealed within a tool housing. And he was not troubled by any of this because in 31 prior iterations this document had done its job. Dutton told Larkin without looking up that he should get the supplemental done, that if he matched the supporting details he'd be finished in 10 minutes. Kid was verbally combative when detained. Add that it helps establish justification for the extraction, and Larkin stared at his screen and thought about what it would mean in 5 years or 10 years to have filed a report that used the word combative to describe a young man who had narrated every movement before making it, who had said "sir," who had asked a legitimate question about the reason for his detention and then complied, even when the answer was a lie. Trent Larkin said, catching himself correcting the taillight was working. Dutton's typing slowed fractionally, then resumed. Larkin pressed both lights were lit when they pulled up. He could see them from the passenger seat of the cruiser. Dutton could see them from the driver's seat, and Dutton knew he could see them. Dutton turned in his chair and delivered the warning with the calm, measured certainty of a man who has used this particular silence as currency for a long time, and has no reason to believe the exchange rate has changed 2 years. In evaluation 31 commendations. Full support of Captain Brent and everyone above him who mattered. I'm telling you, this was a clean stop on a suspicious subject. Don't make it complicated, and he turned back to his screen. Larkin sat with the blank report for 4 more minutes. Then he closed the laptop without saving the document. He sat with his hands in his lap and thought about what he was going to carry forward from tonight. In Captain Brent's office on the 2nd floor, 12 folders sat in a filing cabinet in the corner in the dark, containing between them the documented grievances of 12 individuals who had been through versions of tonight, and who had filed complaints, and who had been told in various administrative formulations that their complaints had been reviewed and found insufficient. The folders were not officially suppressed. They had simply never been read by anyone with the authority or the inclination to do anything about them. They would not wait much longer. Governor Calvin Webb had been in the state capitol's 14th floor conference room since 6:15 in the evening, and the infrastructure appropriations meeting had run 2 hours and 45 minutes past its scheduled end time, which meant it had run through the entirety of Jordan's tutoring session and the drive home, and the stop on Cedarwood Avenue, and most of the booking process at the 14th precinct, all of it occurring on the other side of the city, while Calvin sat at a long laminate table arguing about highway allocation percentages. He was 54 years old and had been governor for 6 years, and before that had spent 15 years in the district attorney's office, the last 4, as DA himself, and he carried that work with him, everywhere. The instinct for evidence, for sequence, for the specific question of what the facts actually support, as distinct from what a person's interest in the facts suggests they support. And he had spent 6 years in the governor's office trying to navigate the gap between what a situation was and what the same situation could be made to look like in ways he could live with when he was alone with himself at the end of the day. He loosened his tie, walking back to his private office, picked up his phone from the desk and scrolled through the accumulated notifications with the practiced efficiency of a man managing high-volume staffers. Department heads, a news alert he would read in the morning, his wife Gloria's text about Thursday dinner, and at the bottom of the list 1 missed call and 1 voicemail, both from Jordan. He pressed play, fitting in his earbuds as he sat down, already setting his overcoat aside, because he assumed it was something small. A car, question money for art supplies, whether the Thursday dinner was formal. The first sound was his son's breathing, and before the first word arrived, the breathing told him what the words were going to say. He had known Jordan's breathing for 18 years, had learned it in the first hours of the boy's life, and had never stopped tracking it with the involuntary, continuous attention of a parent. And the breathing in this voicemail, careful, controlled, the specific quality that Jordan used when he was afraid, and was choosing not to show it, arrived before the words did, and hit him before the words did. "Dad, it's me. I've been arrested. I'm at the Midfield 14th Precinct on Fenwick Road. There's an officer named Dutton. He said my taillight was out, but it wasn't. I checked it. He found Grandpa's box cutter in the car and said it was a concealed weapon. Dad, I haven't done anything. I was just coming home from tutoring. Please call me back. I don't know what to do." The voicemail ended. Calvin Webb sat with absolute stillness for 30 seconds. The infrastructure spreadsheet was on the table in front of him, and none of it existed. He played the message again and listened this time to the half-second fracture in Jordan's voice on the word nothing, the place where the control had almost broken and then been pulled back together. And he felt that specific necessary fracture travel through him, the way certain sounds travel through a parent, regardless of distance or circumstance. The wave of fury that came was legitimate and enormous, and he let it move through him completely. Let it be what it was, total and unsparing. And then it was done, and what remained was cold and targeted and operational. He had fought against this reality for the entirety of his political career, had passed accountability legislation and reformed oversight structures, and spoken at 100 town halls in 100 neighborhoods where people understood what he was speaking about. From the inside, from lived experience, and he had given Jordan the protocol, not because he believed the protocol would always work, but because it was the best available tool he had to offer against the worst available outcome. Something actionable, some way to move through the encounter with the best odds available rather than being simply subject to it with no preparation at all. The protocol had worked perfectly. Jordan had done every single thing right. He was in a holding cell on Fenwick Road. Calvin was not going to panic, and he was not going to make the kind of calls that could be characterized as executive pressure applied to a legitimate arrest, because he needed to understand the situation fully before he did anything that could be mischaracterized and used to muddy the water. What he was going to do was get his son out of that cell, and then he was going to understand exactly what had happened. And then when he understood exactly what had happened, he was going to make sure that it could not simply be absorbed and buried the way similar things had been absorbed and buried before in filing cabinets and settled complaints and sealed records over and over until the next time. He stood up, he reached for his overcoat. Colonel Sandra Reeves, superintendent of the state police, answered on the second ring with the complete, immediate alertness of someone who does not require a transition between sleep and operational readiness. And Calvin identified himself and apologized for the hour, and asked her to confirm that his son Jordan Webb was currently in custody at the Midfield 14th Precinct on Fenwick Road, and requested a state trooper at that precinct in 20 minutes. Unmarked vehicle, no lights. No sirens. Not a demonstration of power, but a presence, someone who understood what was at stake. She confirmed Trooper Pollard was en route, ETA 18 minutes. Chief Leonard Marsh answered his phone with the thick, disoriented voice of a man pulled from deep sleep, and Calvin did not soften the opening. Identified himself, told Marsh that his son Jordan was currently in one of his holding cells, named the arresting officer, named the tail light, named the box cutter, and then paused for exactly one beat and said he wanted to understand how that had happened. The fogginess left Marsh's voice so quickly it was almost audible, replaced by the tight, careful alertness of a man who has just understood that what he says in the next 60 seconds will be part of a record that matters for the rest of his career. Calvin gave 4 instructions in sequence, without heat and without negotiation. Jordan in Marsh's office when he arrived, not in a cell, belongings returned intact. No files accessed, no reports modified, no keyboards touched by anyone involved in the arrest, until Calvin reviewed the documentation personally, and he wanted the dashcam footage from the cruiser preserved before anyone had the opportunity to find a technical reason why it couldn't be. He ended the call before Marsh could respond with anything that would require a follow-up. He drove himself dark, unremarkable government sedan. No security detail, no statement being made through the composition of his arrival party. And he drove at the speed limit, and he thought during those 23 minutes on the highway about the 11 months of legislative work that had gone into his first accountability bill, and about the morning he had signed it, and about the newspaper column that had called it a promising start, and about the particular bitter precision of that phrase. A promising start applied to the problem of whether a black teenager could drive home from tutoring without being arrested for carrying his grandfather's pocket tool, and about what this night was evidence of, in terms of what enough would actually require. At the 14th precinct on Fenwick Road, Dutton's phone buzzed on his desk for the third time. He did not look at it. He was adding a final sentence to his incident report, and he was pleased with how it had come out. Dutton found Larkin in the break room with his phone in his hand, and a quality in his expression not frightened exactly, but containing a kind of stunned, recalibrating attention that Dutton had never seen on the younger man's face that told Dutton before a word was spoken that something had changed in a way that could not be unchanged. Larkin held up his phone. On the screen was a Google search result, and at the top of the results was a photograph from 7 months ago in the state newspaper. A ribbon-cutting ceremony at a new hospital wing, 3 people standing at the ribbon. Governor Calvin Webb and his wife Gloria, and between them their son Jordan, 18 years old, in a dark jacket over a t-shirt with his father's particular quality of self-possession and his father's eyes. The name on the registration, Gloria M. Webb. Dutton looked at the photograph for a long time with the expression of a man examining evidence of something he has done and cannot undo, and finding in the examination that there is no angle from which the evidence is not exactly what it appears to be. He set the phone down on the break room counter with great care. The way a person sets down an object they have just realized is far more fragile than they understood when they picked it up. He began running through his options the way he always ran through options, with the practiced speed of a man who has been calculating institutional risks for 18 years. But this time the options did not multiply as he expected them to. They narrowed. They converged. They arrived at a single point that was not an option at all, but simply the shape of a situation that had already completed itself. At the booking desk, Sergeant Roy Becker received the call from Colonel Reeves's office, State Police, a senior administrator, confirming that Jordan Ellis Webb was in custody, and informing him in a voice that left no room for misinterpretation that Governor Calvin Webb was personally en route to this precinct. Becker listened, set the receiver down with great care, and looked across the bullpen at Officer Craig Dutton, who was sitting at his desk with the comfortable satisfaction of a craftsman reviewing completed work. "Dutton," he said, and his voice had a quality in it that had not been there before. A flatness, an absence of the ambient boredom that usually colored everything he said on the night shift. That was the state police. They wanted to confirm we have a Jordan Webb in custody. He paused, letting each word settle separately. Governor Calvin Webb is personally on his way to this precinct right now. The name moved through the bullpen like a change in air pressure, not loud, the opposite of loud. The kind of quiet that arrives when a room's collective attention has been redirected at a single point, and everything that had been happening before has simply stopped. The officers at their desks looked up. Larkin's face went pale in a long, steady departure of color. Dutton's keyboard hand froze over the keys, fingers curved and touching nothing. Dutton pulled out his phone and opened a browser and found the photograph in 6 seconds. The ribbon cutting the Governor, Gloria, and Jordan, and the face in it was the face that had turned to look at him on the side of Cedarwood Avenue and said, "Please," with a steadiness that had cost more than it looked like. He looked at the photograph for a long time. When Chief Marsh arrived minutes later and called both officers into his office, they had to walk across the bullpen past the officers who had been there when Dutton had announced the stop, with the easy satisfaction of a man presenting a result who had heard the joke about the artist. And those officers said nothing. Not one of them. They sat at their desks, and they watched, and the silence they maintained was not the silence of indifference, but the silence of people who have just understood something and are absorbing what it means, and Dutton felt every step of that crossing in a way he had never felt anything in 18 years of walking across that floor. Marsh arrived at the precinct 4 minutes ahead of the governor and took the cell key from the duty guard himself and walked to cell 3 himself, because he was not going to allow Calvin Webb to find his son still in a cage, and whatever else happened tonight, that particular image would not be part of it. Jordan looked up from the metal bench, straight-backed hands folded in his lap. The posture of a person who has made a decision about how to occupy a space that was designed to diminish him, and he looked at the arriving chief with the careful assessing attention of someone who has decided to note everything and trust nothing, which Marsh recognized as a fair and reasonable response to everything this young man's evening had contained. Marsh said Jordan's name and told him there had been a serious mistake tonight and asked him to come with him. And Jordan stood without hurry, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the cell with the measured step of a person who has been sitting still in a cold room for a long time, and who has decided precisely how he is going to move when he is finally able to move. In the booking area, Marsh had Becker return Jordan's belongings before any further discussion. The wallet, the phone, the $3, the chapstick, his grandfather's brass key, and Jordan turned the key over. Once in his fingers, the key to the house on Presley Street, the key to going home, and put it in his pocket. Marsh apologized, told Jordan his father was on his way, said they would address everything completely and transparently. Jordan said, "Thank you, Chief." 2 words complete and measured, offering exactly what was offered, and not one thing more. The economy of a person who has learned in a single night that words are a resource to be conserved. Calvin walked through the front doors of the precinct in a dark overcoat thrown over work clothes open. Collar, no tie, no security detail, a man so certain of his authority in this moment that he had not needed to dress for it, which made him in the institutional environment of a police precinct. At midnight, considerably more formidable than any suit would have, and his eyes found Jordan the instant he crossed the threshold. Not after scanning the room. Not after acknowledging the chief of police who was standing near the booking desk. Not after registering the officers who had gone entirely still at their desks. Immediately, with the specific directional force of a father's attention, which operates by its own physics and is not subject to the protocols of professional environments. He crossed the room and knelt slightly enough to bring himself to his son's level, and he took Jordan's face in both hands and looked at him with an intensity that was entirely private, entirely not for the room. The full concentrated regard of a parent who has driven through the dark to his child and is now for the first time in 3 hours actually looking at him. He saw the marks on Jordan's wrists. He saw them, and his jaw set by one precise degree and then released, and then set again. He pulled Jordan into an embrace that lasted 4 seconds, and those 4 seconds contained everything that the distance and the institution and the professional occasion could not contain: the full, unmediated relief of a father who has found his child intact, and Jordan's face changed during those 4 seconds. In a way it had not changed all night. The composed, calibrated steadiness going out of it entirely, replaced briefly and completely by the face of an 18-year-old who had been genuinely frightened for 3 hours, and who was, for these 4 seconds, not required to manage that fear anymore. Then the embrace ended. Jordan straightened. The steadiness returned. He said, "I'm okay, Dad. I'm okay," in the same careful, controlled tone that had been on the voicemail, and Calvin released him and stood and turned to face the room, and the transformation was immediate and total. The father stepped aside, and in the space he had occupied stood the governor, the 6-year incumbent, the former prosecutor, the man who had cross-examined senators and budget committees and police chiefs with the same quality of patient, implacable attention that made it clear he was not interested in the performance of accountability, but in accountability itself. Calvin asked for the incident report first, and Marsh slid it across the desk, and Calvin picked it up and read the first paragraph in the way lawyers read, not for sense, but for specific words, the specific phrases, the architecture of the claims being made. And when he read aloud, his voice was perfectly level, carrying each word with the weight of something being submitted into evidence. He read the tail light claim and stopped. He told Dutton that the impound lot had confirmed both lights were fully functional. He had helped replace that specific bulb himself 4 months ago in his own driveway. And he asked one direct question with the measured calm of a man who already knows the answer, but wants it on the record. "Did my son's tail light appear non-functional to you at the time of the stop? Or did you identify a reason for the stop after you had already decided to make it?" The silence stretched. Dutton's mouth opened. Calvin said, "That is your answer. You were not mistaken. You were lying." We will confirm that with the footage within the hour. He turned the page. He read the behavioral description aloud, displayed unusual nervousness, provided evasive responses to routine questioning, and then he explained what Jordan's behavior actually was with the patient, precise delivery of a man who has prepared this explanation carefully, because he has been preparing some version of it for years. He said that Jordan had been taught the protocol since he was 14 years old. Interior light on hands at 10, and 2 narrate every movement, address the officer as "Sir, do not argue, do not reach for anything without announcing it first," and that the behavior Dutton had characterized as nervousness and evasiveness was the product of years of specific, deliberate preparation by 2 parents who understood that their son's survival in encounters like this one depended on performing perfect documented compliance. The nervousness you saw Officer Dutton was not deception. It was terror, the completely rational terror of a young black man who has been taught that this specific kind of stop with this specific dynamic can end in ways that compliance does not always prevent. He moved his eyes to Larkin. "Officer Larkin, you were present for every moment of this stop. Did my son display the behavior Officer Dutton describes in this report?" Larkin looked at Dutton once briefly without expression. He looked at the governor, and then he shook his head once slowly, without ambiguity, without qualification, without any of the hedging that the last 3 hours of silence might have made available to him. Dutton's eyes went to Larkin with an expression that was for one fraction of a second entirely unguarded, the raw exposure of a man whose last possible ally has just made a visible choice, and who has understood in that instant precisely what it means. Calvin set the report on Marsh's desk. "You arrested my son for being an artist," he said, and the simplicity of it had a quality that a more elaborate formulation would not have had. "For carrying his late grandfather's pocket tool in the car he drives in the seat pocket where it has been sitting for 4 months. For driving home at 30 miles per hour from the community center where he tutors children in mathematics on Tuesday evenings." He paused. "Every single characterization in this report is a fabrication constructed after you had already made a decision. You made that decision before you turned on your lights. You made it before you spoke a single word to my son. You made it the moment you saw him." Calvin gave 3 directives to Marsh in sequence calmly, without raising his voice, because raising his voice was not necessary and had never been his style when the facts were doing the work for him. Both officers suspended effective immediately, badges and weapons surrendered before he left the building. The State Attorney General's office to oversee the internal investigation, not the department's own internal affairs division. The AG to ensure genuine independence, and to ensure that the review would not be conducted by the same institution that had been producing the problem. And every incident report filed by Dutton in the last 3 years to be flagged for individual review, every single one, because 31 commendations built on the same methodology meant 31 records that deserved a second look. Marsh said yes. Governor without hesitation, because whatever else Marsh was, and he was a man who had made many compromises in the direction of institutional convenience, he was also a man who could read a room with perfect accuracy. And this room was not producing any ambiguity about what was required. In Marsh's office with Calvin and Jordan waiting in the outer room, Dutton and Larkin stood before the chief's desk, and Marsh placed both hands on the surface and asked them to surrender their service weapons and badges in a voice that was neutral and formal, because this was a formal act, and he performed it as one. Dutton unpinned his badge from the fabric of his shirt with hands that were not entirely steady. A slight vibration just below the threshold of visible trembling, and he placed the badge on Marsh's desk, and the sound it made on the wood, a clean, flat metallic impact, arrived in the room as something more than a sound, carrying the specific quality of a period at the end of a sentence that had been running for 18 years, and had now finally and irrevocably come to its close. Larkin set his badge and weapon down with a different kind of simplicity. The simplicity of someone who had completed this action internally before being asked to perform it physically, and did not look at Dutton. Through the glass panel in Marsh's door, Jordan was visible in the outer office, sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, looking at a point on the floor between his feet, thinking very carefully about something he would need considerable time to fully understand. He heard the sounds from inside the office, the metallic sequence of weapons being set down, badges following, and he closed his eyes briefly, not in satisfaction, but in something quieter and more complicated than satisfaction. Something that was the beginning of understanding that a machine had been interrupted in its operation tonight, and that the interruption had cost him something. It should never have been necessary for him to pay. Lead investigator Patricia Holloway and her partner arrived at the 14th precinct at 5:47 in the morning before the day shift, which was intentional, coming with aluminum equipment cases and the unhurried directional purposefulness of people who have received a full briefing and know precisely what they are looking for. And Holloway, 11 years with the Attorney General's office, 44 years old, with a quality of organized calm that made rooms feel more structured. When she entered them, commandeered the conference room and asked for the dashcam footage first. The footage played on a laptop in 12 minutes, and Holloway watched it without pausing, her notepad open, and nothing yet written on it, her expression neutral and attentive. On the screen, the silver Malibu moving at exactly 30 miles per hour, holding a perfectly straight line in the center of its lane, and both tail lights visibly, clearly, unambiguously illuminated, steady and red against the dark asphalt. No flicker, no intermittent failure. 2 functioning lights. Then the audio, 32 seconds before Dutton activated his emergency lights, his voice coming through the cruiser's interior microphone. Black kid in a Malibu at midnight on Cedarwood. I guarantee you, he didn't drive here from that neighborhood. Let's see what he's carrying. She reached over and pressed stop. She interviewed Dutton at 8:15 with his union representative present, who opened with a procedural objection to the scope of the investigation and received from Holloway a single, clear sentence before she moved on. The scope was authorized under the federal civil rights statute and was not subject to modification by the union's preferences. She placed the audio transcript on the table. Dutton tried 3 constructions out of context, informal vehicle language, his 18-year record speaking to his professional intentions. She set the precinct's incident log beside the transcript. No break-ins within 6 blocks of the Cedarwood stop. No active description, no circulating bolo that could have provided a factual basis for the suspicion stated in his report. And Dutton left the interview looking the way a man looks when the building he has been standing in has just been revealed to have no walls whatsoever, and he had been standing in it for 18 years. Larkin's interview was a different thing entirely. He arrived alone, declined the offer to wait for representation, and talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes with the complete, unhesitating clarity of a man who has decided there is only one available direction and is moving in it, the stop, in granular detail. The functioning taillights he could see from the passenger seat of the cruiser, Jordan's compliance throughout every single movement, the box cutter obviously, and immediately, a tool. His own silence on the roadside as a choice made out of fear, and the word choice carried in his voice the weight of a genuine accounting of something he would have preferred not to account for. And then he described 6 prior incidents, 6 pretextual stops. Young black male drivers, Northern Precinct, beats the previous 14 months. The same methodology, the same documentation, the same outcomes. Each one producing an arrest report with the same structural relationship to the actual events that Dutton's report about Jordan had to the events of Tuesday night. He calls it proactive policing, Larkin said. He sees someone he thinks doesn't belong, and he finds the reason afterward. And then he writes it up and it sticks because nobody reads it closely enough, and the people it happens to don't have the resources to make someone read it closely. 6 names added to Holloway's case file. She began the process of contacting each of them that afternoon. Union Representative Bob Farrell met Dutton in a small room adjacent to the conference suite at 2:15 in the afternoon, and the quality of the meeting was different from anything their previous interactions had been. Because in their previous interactions, Farrell had been an advocate in an adversarial proceeding, and today he was a man delivering a verdict that had already been reached without his participation. He dropped a folder on the table and did not sit down. 12 prior complaints, he said, the full internal affairs file which Holloway's people had taken from Captain Brent's office at 10 that morning, and 3 of the complainants had already been contacted and confirmed their willingness to give formal statements, and 2 of them, based on what Holloway had told him that afternoon, would produce separate charges. The union's legal counsel, he continued, was not going to provide representation for conduct classified under the federal civil rights statute, and once the federal threshold was established, which the dashcam audio established, before anything else they were contractually out, not optionally out, and there was no mechanism within the union agreement to change that. He placed a private attorney's business card on the table. The department covered you 12 times, he said, and he said it the way an accountant reads a balance, without feeling and without emphasis. The 12th time you arrested the governor's son on dashcam. Everybody has a limit. He picked up his briefcase and walked out. Captain Brent received a call from a state investigator that same afternoon informing him that his internal affairs file had been requisitioned and was now part of the federal record, and that the investigation would include a formal review of every administrative action used to prevent each complaint from reaching formal review, which meant a formal review of every decision he had made for 12 years about what to look at closely and what to leave in a drawer. He said he understood. He did not argue. He drove home and told his wife over dinner, and she said, "I know," and they sat for a long time after that without speaking, in the specific silence of people who have been waiting for something for so long that its arrival brings grief rather than surprise. The federal trial opened on a Monday in March and lasted 4.5 days, and federal prosecutor Carla Jennings opened by doing something that produced an immediate and total silence in the courtroom. She played the dashcam audio, without introduction, without context, without telling the jury what they were about to hear, and she let it play from the moment Dutton's cruiser pulled out from behind the dry cleaner on Cedarwood Avenue to the moment Jordan was placed in the back seat, and she said nothing during it, and the audio filled the room, the sound of tires on wet asphalt. Dutton's voice 32 seconds before the lights went on. "I guarantee you, he didn't drive here from that neighborhood. Let's see what he's carrying," and then the stop itself. Jordan's steady responses, his narration of every movement, his calm and precise compliance with every instruction, and then the sound of handcuffs. When it ended, she said one sentence: "The government will prove that every word in Officer Dutton's incident report was constructed after the decision to stop Jordan Webb had already been made not on evidence but on the color of his skin and the hour of the night and the neighborhood where he was driving." Jordan sat in the front row in the same dark jacket he had worn to tutoring on the night this began, and beside him, Calvin sat with the controlled, measured expression of a man receiving a result he has worked to produce and who understands clearly that the result is necessary and not sufficient, because necessary results never are. Shane Larkin took the stand on the second day and testified for 2 hours and 25 minutes with the complete, unhesitating clarity of a man who has decided there is only one remaining thing to do and is doing it: the stop in full. The taillights he could see from his seat in the cruiser, Jordan's compliance at every step, the box cutter that was obviously a tool, the 6 prior incidents with 6 names and 6 specific dates and 6 descriptions of the same methodology applied to the same category of person in the same geographic area over and over. While Larkin said nothing and filed nothing and gathered the scattered sketchbook pages off the wet asphalt and convinced himself that one small, decent thing was sufficient. The prosecutor's final question was simple: "Why didn't you act at the time?" Larkin was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Because I was afraid of what it would cost me, and I have spent every day since that night understanding what it costs not to." On the 3rd day of trial, a 23-year-old man named Marcus Grant walked to the witness stand and was sworn in, and what he described in the next 40 minutes constituted the most important 40 minutes of the entire proceeding, because Marcus Grant was not a federal agent and was not a governor's son, and had no father who could make a phone call that produced results. He was a young black man who had been pulled over by Craig Dutton on a residential street 3 miles from his own apartment, found completely clean in a thorough search, and arrested anyway on the basis of a handgun that Dutton produced from the trunk of his cruiser, a weapon that Marcus had never seen before that night, and whose serial number, as the prosecution subsequently established, matched one of the firearms found in Dutton's equipment locker during the investigation. Marcus had spent 19 months in county jail for that arrest. He lost his construction job in the second month when the contractor who had employed him for 3 years filled the position and could not hold it any longer, and he had not been able to find comparable work in the time since his release, because a weapons conviction, even an expunged one, follows a man in ways that expungement does not fully address. He described all of this on the stand with the flat, careful steadiness of a person who has been telling this story for long enough that the edges of it have worn smooth, and the smoothness was not indifference. It was the particular dignity of someone who survived something that should not have been required to be survived, and who has decided in the aftermath of surviving it to still be standing. And then he described the thing that the flat, careful steadiness could not entirely contain. Before the arrest, he had been saving money for 2 years, putting aside a fixed amount every paycheck, without touching it, through car repairs and a broken furnace and every other thing that eats into a budget, to take his younger sister to see their grandmother in Alabama, the first visit in 5 years, because distance and money had made it impossible before. The arrest happened 6 weeks before he had saved enough. In 19 months of county jail, the grandmother died. They never made the trip. He said this without dramatic emphasis, in the same flat, careful tone, and it sat in the courtroom the way certain facts sit, not requiring elaboration, not inviting response, simply present and permanent. Calvin watched Marcus Grant testify with an expression that contained everything the legislation and the press conferences and the years of accountability work could not fully contain: the knowledge, direct and specific and personal, that this was what happened when the phone call could not be made, when the name on the registration was not a name that stopped anything, when the filing cabinet in Captain Brent's office held 12 complaints and would have held a 13th, and the machine continued without interruption. And Jordan watched Marcus Grant and understood with a clarity that would stay with him for the rest of his life exactly why his father had written in the statement he drafted himself without staff assistance, longer and more personal than his official statements usually were, that the fact that he was able to make a phone call that produced results was not the lesson. The lesson was what every citizen deserved, and most of them, without that phone call, would not have gotten. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts: perjury for the false tail light statement, falsifying a government record for the fabricated incident report, and deprivation of rights under color of law filed under the federal civil rights statute, and the man sitting at the defense table in an ill-fitting gray suit, who had lost 30 pounds in pretrial detention and whose buzz cut had grown out into something unkempt, bore almost no resemblance to the officer who had sat at a desk 18 years ago and begun typing a career's worth of reports that bore only a tangential relationship to what had actually occurred on the street. Judge Patricia Harrow read Dutton's full conduct record into the open court record at sentencing, every complaint, every name, every date, every administrative action that had been taken to prevent each complaint from reaching formal review. And she described this record not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a coherent pattern, the same decision made the same way against the same category of person for the same reasons over 18 years. And she said the thing that would be quoted most frequently in the coverage that followed this court finds that the distinction between this case and the 11 that preceded it is not Officer Dutton's conduct. The conduct was identical. The distinction is the resources available to the victim's family. That is not justice. That is not even close to justice. This court will not allow that distinction to determine the outcome of this proceeding. 4 years in federal prison, pension stripped, restitution ordered to Jordan Webb for legal costs. The federal marshals approached the defense table and the handcuffs came out the same steel, the same ratcheting sound, the same specific bite of metal against bone, and Jordan watched until Dutton was gone through the side door, and he did not look away. And then he sat for a moment with the fact of it and looked at his father, and neither of them spoke, because what there was to say had been said in a voicemail 4 months ago, and in 40 minutes of testimony from a man named Marcus Grant, and in 4 days of documented record, and anything further was not the moment's job. A plain white envelope arrived on a Saturday morning, 8 months after the arrest, postmarked from the Federal Correctional Facility in Grayfield. No name in the return address field. Only a zip code that Jordan recognized, and he sat at the kitchen table and opened it and read 2.5 handwritten pages without stopping. Not an apology, not one sentence functioning as an apology, but a sustained and detailed document of grievance. Dutton making the case that he had been wronged, describing his stolen career and his lost pension and his sold house and his ruined reputation and 18 years of commendations, and calling Jordan a pawn in a political operation, ending with "You and your father think you're heroes. But all you did was destroy a man's life over a misunderstanding that goodwill could have fixed. I hope you're satisfied." Jordan read it a second time, and the first response was the residue of the original anger returning briefly and recognizably. And the second response was something quieter and more honest. A specific sadness for a mind trapped so thoroughly inside the story it had been telling itself that the story had become the only available reality. A mind in which not one sentence said, "I made choices that brought me here." He folded the letter. He walked to the recycling bin and placed it inside. He returned to his desk, opened his sketchbook, and drew his grandfather's hands. The Jordan Ellis Webb Accountability Act passed the state legislature in March and was signed on the Capitol steps in the March wind. 3 provisions that had survived 6 weeks of hearings and 4 rounds of amendments. Independent oversight of use of force incidents by a body with no departmental affiliation. Mandatory 5-year preservation of all dash cam and body cam footage, with criminal penalties for unauthorized deletion, and mandatory criminal penalties, not administrative consequences alone, for officers found to have filed materially false police reports. Calvin handed Jordan the ceremonial pen after the signing, and Jordan held it for a moment in both hands, feeling the warmth of his father's grip still in the metal. And then he put it in his jacket pocket and said nothing, and the cameras recorded the silence. And the silence was the statement. The gallery show opened at the university the following spring. 14 pieces, charcoal and oil, built entirely from the experience of a single Tuesday night in October. And the centerpiece was a 6-foot charcoal of a young man's face, split by red light on one side and blue on the other, looking directly out of the frame with an expression that was neither defiance nor defeat, but something that existed in the demanding space between them. A face unchanged by the light that was falling on it, uncollapsed still exactly itself. Jordan donated 20% of the proceeds to a legal fund supporting people charged on the basis of falsified police reports. Shane Larkin, in the same month the show opened, was working as a case counselor at a youth diversion center, using his knowledge of police procedure to demystify it for young people who needed that knowledge and had never had access to it. Not absolved, not forgiven by the record, simply trying to build something usable from what he had been. 1 year after the arrest, Jordan drove home on Cedarwood Avenue. Same road, same October hour, same dark sky. The ornamental trees now bare rather than turning their branches clean against the amber of the streetlights in his mother's silver Malibu. Both hands easy on the wheel, the radio low, the speedometer reading exactly 30 miles per hour. He passed the spot where the dry cleaner had been, which was now a smoothie shop with a different sign but the same parking spot. And he did not look at it, and he did not check his mirror for lights that were not there, because the scholarship was paid, and his portfolio was submitted. And his second year began in a week, and Devin had passed his 8th grade standardized test and was beginning cautiously, and with the specific wariness of someone who has been disappointed before, to suspect that he might actually be good at this, and the brick drawing problem had been solved 3 months ago. Edge of the charcoal stick direction of the mortar lines exactly as he had figured it out on the drive home from tutoring on the night the lights hit him. He drove to the end of Cedarwood and turned east toward home, and there was nothing in his mirror, and there was nothing behind him at all, and the road ahead was open, and the night was cool, and he was driving it home. He was not the same boy who had made this drive a year ago, but the road did not know that, and it did not matter, because some things you carry through, and some things you put in the recycling bin, and some things you draw, and some things you sign into law, and some things you simply drive through at exactly 30 miles per hour with both hands on the wheel and your grandfather's memory in the seat pocket and your whole life in front of you, earned and real and still, despite everything full of everything you have worked hard enough to deserve. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how many filing cabinets it gets buried in, we hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Stories like this one matter not because justice always arrives, but because when it does, it deserves to be witnessed and remembered and passed on. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one.